The first paper I want to go through together, that's inside the brochure. So forget the brochure for a minute, and let's go through my main argument, and then we'll go through the details. Peace in any community requires various degrees of justice and order. If we can't have justice, we won't have peace. Secondly, justice and protection of human rights require a legal system of enforceable just laws. Thirdly, the creation and enforcement of laws require some form of government. Number 4, democratic governments are limited with checks and balances. They have peaceful transitions of power through free elections, voting, and constitutions. And number 5, the current United Nations Confederacy of Sovereign National Governments based on international law, which is simply customs and treaties, is non-democratic. It's a non-democratic war system that's been unable to prevent wars, get rid of nuclear weapons, genocide, and terrorism, as well as not being able to solve our many global problems. So, if that's true, therefore, world peace for the world community requires a peace system of a democratic world federal government, which would be based on the principle of subsidiarity. Now, that means that we would continue to have all the governments that we currently have on the local level, on the state level, and on the national level. But what I'm proposing is that we create a fourth layer of government that we currently don't have, and that's what we need in order to solve our global problems. And so that's what the idea of subsidiarity is, that problems are solved at their lowest level possible. But such a world federal government would create world laws and prosecute individuals who violate them. So world peace requires world law and order. Now, how can we go about creating such a system? I think the world's religions have the responsibility of building the firm foundation for world peace by promoting the ideals of world community, by emphasizing the teachings of the Golden Rule that all the religions teach, the global ethic that we'll see, the Charter for Compassion, the idea of the human family as stewards of our common planet, teaching world citizenship, and humatriotism. Humatriotism is the attitude of being loyal to the human family, above and beyond patriotism. Patriotism has to be taught under the current system in order to convince people to kill each other in wars. But we have to go beyond patriotism in order to be humatriotic. And I have some pictures over here. First, the picture of our planet that our astronauts have taken to realize we share a planet together and we have to take care of it. But then to the left of that is a statue of a human being with a hammer beating a sword into a plowshare, going back to the biblical verse that we need to beat our swords into plowshares, the instruments of war into the instruments of peace. That statue is right outside the United Nations building in New York City. To the right of that is a mosaic of people from all over the world representing different cultures and different religions. And at the bottom is the Golden Rule that all the great religions teach. That mosaic is inside the United Nations building in New York City. Okay? Now, with that argument, if you follow me so far, if you would look at the brochure that I've written, and we're not going to read the whole thing together, but there are a few sections that I think are very important that we go through together. If you go on the first page of the brochure, inside the brochure, the section that has the dots. So, the closest thing that we have created so far to try and solve global problems is the United Nations organization. It, of course, is much better than the League of Nations that preceded it. Since the League of Nations was unable to prevent World War II, during and after World War II, many nations of the world created the United Nations. But it's still weak and ineffective and unable to solve many global problems for these reasons. The United Nations is a confederacy, which is a weak political organization. The UN is based on the principle of sovereign equality of all national governments. In other words, the United Nations is not an authority over nations. All nations retain complete sovereignty. Thirdly, the United Nations is based on the concept of collective security, which continues the war system. 4, the United Nations General Assembly is a non-democratic organization where one nation each gets one vote, regardless of the population of the country. And the General Assembly only passes non-binding resolutions to begin with. Okay? In other words, even if they pass a resolution, it simply says the way nations should act. So this is very important to realize that the UN doesn't create world laws and hold individuals accountable. It simply passes these resolutions at times. The problem is the difference in population between countries. We now have 193 different nations, the most populous being China with 1.3 billion people, and then we have micro nations which like Nauru and Tuvalu. Anyone ever hear of those nations? Island nations in the Pacific? Those countries only have 10,000 people. So all the other countries have populations in between. The problem is that each nation gets one vote in the General Assembly. Okay? So what that means is you can have a majority vote take place in the UN General Assembly that only counts for 8% of the world's population. Then the next thought is how the United Nations Security Council is often impotent in preventing wars. That's its role, to try and bring peace to the world, but it doesn't because of the way it's set up. At any one time, the Security Council has 15 members. 5 of the 15 are permanent members, and the 5 permanent members are the United States, Russia, China, France, and the United Kingdom. They are the victors of the Second World War when the UN was set up. They're all nuclear nations. The other 10 of the 15 members of the Security Council at any one time are rotating members of the other nations. They take turns being on that council. For a resolution to pass, it takes 3/5 of the council, or 9 out of 15, without any veto of any one of the 5 permanent members. So even if there's a vote in the Security Council of 14-1, if the one was a permanent member who voted against it, the resolution will not go forward. That's what's happened during most of the history of the United Nations, where one of the 5 permanent members have been involved in a conflict directly or indirectly through one of their allies, and have therefore either vetoed or threatened to veto a resolution which would solve the conflict. So a long-lasting conflict that we're all aware of is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which continues to go unsolved because of the threat of the United States veto for many years in favor of Israel. There are other conflicts, for example, the one in Darfur a number of years ago, the genocide that was going on in Sudan at that time. Resolutions vetoed by China because China was getting its oil from the Sudan. And many other examples where one of the 5 permanent members will veto or threaten to veto a resolution. So that's why wars continue. Next, the United Nations system has to rely on dues from national governments, which are not always paid. For a number of years, the United States wouldn't even pay its dues to the United Nations. And most people don't realize how little the UN works on, what the budget is. The annual budget for the UN system, the whole system, is close to $4 billion a year. Now, to individuals like us, that sounds like a lot of money. But you know, on the global level, that is chump change. Every state in the United States has a bigger budget than the entire United Nations system. Okay? Think of that. The budget of Delaware, the budget of Rhode Island, the budget of Montana, very small budgets compared to the rest of the state budgets, are greater than the United Nations system, which is supposed to bring peace and resolve conflict throughout the world. So when nations don't even pay their dues, as the United States government and some other governments do not do, then the world suffers even more. And finally, the UN is based on international law, which is a system of customs and treaties. So nations sign treaties with each other, say what they're going to do. The Paris Accord for climate change, of course, is a treaty. The problem with treaties is not every nation keeps their treaties. Most countries keep most of their treaties most of the time, but not all countries keep all their treaties all the time. Okay? What if we had a system of traffic laws based on that idea of people just, saying they'll agree to go a certain speed, but then there's a lack of enforcement. So that's why we have laws. We have laws on the local level and on other levels, but not on the world level. So the United Nations is the greatest thing that humanity has created to this point. Okay? So I'm one of the strongest proponents of the UN. Just imagine what the world would be without it. Okay? The greatest thing the United Nations has done so far is prevented World War III. That's why it was created after World War II. However, wars continue and global problems continue because of the way in which the United Nations was created after the Second World War. So, how do we solve that problem? How do we create a system so that we can better solve global problems? If you go directly across to the next page, where those dots are, here's what I would propose. What we need to create is a democratic world parliament to make world laws, to solve global problems and how nations will relate to each other. So we have to go from a system of treaties to a system of laws that apply to individuals, even national leaders. So that's what we need instead of the United Nations General Assembly. We need a world parliament. Secondly, we need a world executive committee to enforce those world laws instead of the current Security Council. Then we need a world court to judge individuals who violate world laws. Currently, under the United Nations system is the International Court of Justice, the ICJ. It hears treaty violations between nations only when nations are willing to have their case heard by the court. Okay? So that's all that we currently have. Whenever one country feels that another country is violating a treaty that they made together. The closest thing we have currently to what I'm proposing is the International Criminal Court, the ICC, which is different from the ICJ. The ICC is a standing court, a permanent court that has been in existence since 2002 that is able to prosecute individuals involved in genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Okay? The problem is not every nation is a part of that court since it's based on a treaty. Currently, 120 nations of the 193 are parties to the International Criminal Court, but that means that about 70 are not. Included in the 70 that are not are the United States, Russia, and China. The reason why the United States government is not a party to the International Criminal Court is because it would not have a veto over any kind of prosecution. And so, get back to the problem with the veto in the Security Council. So we have to avoid that problem and set up an independent court that would try individuals. Then we need a world police force to arrest individuals who violate world law, a world prison system to incarcerate them, and a world constitution that would make explicit the powers and limitations of the organs of the World Federation, checks and balances between them, rights, powers, and limitations of national governments, and the rights and responsibilities of all citizens of the world. Sound familiar? It's the same basic thing we have in the U.S. Constitution for our nation, but we need to apply that then on the global level. Okay, that's the idea of federation. It wouldn't be a world government that would take over everything. It would simply be a fourth layer of government above and beyond the other layers of government that we currently have. So, that's the proposal. The rest of the papers are more details that you can read on your own later on. Let me just point out a few things. On the back of the first page is how we currently live under a war system. And that is where violent conflict is used in order to solve problems between different groups. If we simply change the word violent to non-violent in the definition of war, then we get the definition for politics. And so we need a kind of global politics under a global federation in order to pass laws that would solve these problems, these world problems that we have. On the next paper is the difference between a confederation and a federation. So the United Nations is a confederation, a confederacy, and what I'm proposing is a federation. Now, those of you familiar with American history know that this is the debate that went on in the 1780s here in the United States, that we would go from the Articles of Confederation to a federal constitution. And that's what we live under currently. So we need the same kind of debate around the world in order to move from the United Nations Confederacy to a federal world government. On the back of that paper is a Pledge of Allegiance to the world. We have a Pledge of Allegiance to the United States and to other nations, but in order to promote the idea of world citizenship, which we would have if we would have a world federation, then we could pledge allegiance to the world and taking care of our planet. Currently, nations are interested only in their national interest, what they perceive to be best for their own nation, rather than what's best for the world. So, I don't envision that such a system would be created very soon. I think it's going to have to evolve over a period of a long time. It might not even happen for several centuries. But still, we know now what it would take to bring about world peace and solve global problems. So that's why we have to work towards the steps that would lead to this kind of ideal. And one step in that direction would be to change the voting system in the current United Nations. And that's what the next paper is, that if we would base the voting system on population and contribution to the UN budget, then we could have a formula where each country's weighted vote would be figured out by population plus contribution plus membership in the UN divided by 3. That way, every vote that would be taken would be based on that formula, and that would represent the idea of a world democracy much better than we currently have. On the back of that paper is how we could currently change the United Nations Security Council by having a formula where different regions of the world, plus some individual nations that have a large enough weighted vote, would be able to vote within the Security Council. That way we could eliminate the idea of certain nations having a veto. We would simply have a weighted vote for the different regions of the world. Then the next paper is the Declaration for a Global Ethic and the Charter for Compassion. These are the statements that have come through the parliaments of the world's religions in the last 25 years, where representatives from all the religions of the world have agreed on these basic ethical principles that could be the basis for a future world federation. Now, if you wonder, is this a new idea? Is this something I just dreamt up? No, this idea has been around for a long time. I happen to be a world federalist, but there are many world federalists here in the United States and in other countries of the world. Back in the 1800s, Baha'u'llah, the founder of the Baha'i faith, had taught about this idea of promoting a world federation, a world commonwealth, and how to have world peace. So the paper on the Baha'i faith you can read in their idea of promoting this proposal. The next paper would be what the recent popes and bishops in the Catholic Church have been teaching about this idea in the last 50 or 60 years. Since the Second Vatican Council, Catholic bishops have talked about outlawing war. The only way you can outlaw war is to create a system of government that would be able to solve conflicts through voting rather than through weapons. The next paper is from the Second Vatican Council of how the Catholic Church promotes dialogue and cooperation among people of all religions. On the next paper is one way in which one Buddhist has promoted the idea of world federation. If we just look at that together, Buddhists promoting Buddha's goal of relieving suffering for all people through love, compassion, and nonviolence. If this were done according to Nirvana, the whole world would be one Buddha land. And Nirvana says in order to work for this goal, then a world federation should be the blueprint. In other words, you have to have some kind of political organization to create this ideal. Then on the back of that paper would be the argument of Hans Kung talking about how there will be no peace among the nations without peace among the religions. So the religions of the world have to cooperate with each other in order to try and promote these ideals of humatriotism and world citizenship, caring for our common planet, seeing everyone as brothers and sisters, that would lead people to creating a world federation. And the final paper would be different meanings of peace. We need inner peace, as some religions teach. We need harmony between people, as other religions teach. And as the Baha'i faith and the Catholic Church and other religions teach, we need public order and security. So those would be different responses to the problem of war. Rather than killing each other in order to solve different problems, we need a peace system based on law and order. So maybe we can discuss this in the next session, okay? Yes? Yeah, so whatever you want to do.